A few general observations. Firstly, Deputy Minister Kodwa made an address to Parliament. Then he was standing in for the previous Minister of State Security on the 1st of June 2021. And he said the following to Parliament: South Africans of all walks of life also have a patriotic duty to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the country against hostile elements that seek to undermine our hard-earned democracy. Some of these hostile elements, including the plethora of information peddlers who have become nation wreckers, whose mission is subversion and sabotage to destabilize legitimate governments. He continues, each time they manifested their hostile machinations, the South African intelligence community is left reeling from mandate disorientation, internal divisions, disruption of business, and more of restructuring fatigue. This was said as part of his opening review in June 2021. And appears to be a response to much of the public criticism of the SSA prevalent at the time, and perhaps arising in large measure from the evidence led before the chair in this commission. Just want to suggest that, state perhaps firmly, Mr. President, that it's not some mysterious nation wreckers or information peddlers that have done the damage that has been done. It's over a decade of mismanagement and unlawful activity by the people in charge, in power. Do you agree with that?
There has been quite a lot of that.
The HLRP report, which you, in fairness to you, commissioned for good reason, and you've stated the reason. The visa investigation, the commission, have all heard substantial evidence in this regard, and all the evidence has not yet come to light, and not even all the evidence that our investigators have produced has been led. It will be compiled and presented to Chair in due course. But if I may just, by way of summary, go back to the main conclusion put before you by Dr. Mufamadi's panel. He said in 2018, our key finding is that there has been a serious politicization and factionalization of the intelligence community over the past decade or more, based on factions in the ruling party, resulting in an almost complete disregard for the Constitution, policy, legislation, and other prescripts, and turning our civilian intelligence community into a private resource to serve the political and personal interests of particular individuals. In addition, we identified a doctrinal shift towards a narrow state security orientation in the intelligence community from 2009, in contradiction to the doctrines outlined in the Constitution, the White Paper on Intelligence, and other prescripts. We are concerned that the cumulative effect of the above led to the deliberate repurposing of the SSA. And the link between those findings and the concept of state capture cannot be lost. And perhaps more severely, the link between that and the failure, any failure that is to be found in the future in relation to the security establishment and the events of June, cannot be underestimated. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
And by way of conclusion, can I put the following to you for your comment? It's not unreasonable, therefore, to propose that any failures at the heels of the SSA in July 2021 and during this period of state capture were a logical and predictable outcome of a history of over 12 years of mismanagement, institutionalized corruption, factionalism, and a redirection of the capacity and resources of the security establishment away from its true objective, the interests of the people as a whole, to serve narrow political, sectional, and private interests. Would that be a fair comment?
I have said that the SSA has a number of quite good people who want to serve the nation and who want to serve the nation diligently. So I will not use a broad brush and say all of it is like that, with a black brush. I would say yes, quite a lot of malfeasance did happen, and it was, the SSA was purposed to serve political and factional interests by certain of its operatives or officials, and certainly not all. As we have now brought the SSA into the presidency, our task is going to be to achieve the objectives that have been, or rather the conclusions that have been set out in the high-level panel report, and in a way to repurpose, reposition the SSA to be an SSA or intelligence service that will serve the interests of the people of South Africa completely and not serve certain interests in society. That is what we are now determined to do.
And to make the point that the chair made during the morning session, that the issue of alertness and prompt action in the future, much of that responsibility will lie, or does lie, with the security establishment.
That is correct.
I'd like to move on to a new topic, please, Mr. President and Chair. First, to go back to an item raised by you, Chair, in relation to the Judicial Service Committee agenda and Commission and the activities of the Deployment Committee in making recommendations and the timing of those events. I'm told by our researcher who's been assisting me, Chair, that the JSC Screening Committee in 2019, January 29, compiled a shortlist of possible appointments to various positions in the judiciary. The Deployment Committee met in this regard and made its own recommendations on the 22nd of March 2019, after the shortlist was compiled. And the interviews of the Judicial Service Committee occurred in April 2019. So there was the shortlist in January, the Deployment Committee meeting recommended judges in March, and the interviews took place in April 2019. That's just the timeline.
Yes. In previous sessions, Mr. President, I can't remember whether including the one where you appeared, but I think when Mr. Mantashe appeared, this was touched upon. I had gained the impression, I think from Mr. Mantashe's evidence, that while the deployment committee does get involved in recommending, I think he put it like that too, names for of people people to be considered for appointment to government, I had gained the impression that the issue of judges doesn't go to the deployment committee. Now, I may have misunderstood, but that's certainly the impression I had got. So I was a little alarmed when I heard that there was a case where it happened. Now, one gets concerned because maybe some of the candidates for judgeship, because of their existing at the time before they are appointed as judges, existing relationship with the ruling party, might get to know, for example, that the deployment party supports them. And one wouldn't like, any issues such as factionalism that one might see in a political party getting into the judiciary. So I'm concerned about that. So has the party itself taken a position that even those who wish to be judges, or at least maybe some of them, or the deployment committee will deal with who should be appointed or who should not? Or was this just an exception? Was it something that should not have happened but did happen?
Chairperson, I think I would like you to look at this in positive light, with a positive spirit. The governing party's agenda is to transform our country from the horrible past that it was, and to transform it fully and completely. And to ensure that the various institutions, not only parliament or executive, various institutions are so representative of the demographics of our country. And I want to hasten to add that without the governing parties' initiatives in this regard, many of the transformative processes that we have today in our country would not be there. Quite frankly, they wouldn't. Many people will deny this, but that is a fact. The governing party has led the process of transformation, and that includes its own views on the transformation of the judiciary. Hitherto, we had a wholly untransformed judiciary. And it is the governing party's insistence, and in latter days, the issue I dealt with yesterday of having women in the judiciary has been an ongoing insistence by the governing party. Now, the best way for the governing party to be able to engender this transformation has been, yes, to discuss, like I would say any other institution. And I know yesterday somebody was saying, there are even lawyers' bodies, either attorneys' bodies and advocates' bodies, who, when even judges are supposed to be presented or nominated, they themselves nominate. They put names forward and they have views, including various bodies, even not legal fraternity entities. So that's lobbying processes. And as I said yesterday, lobbying happens all the time. And similarly, for an institution like the governing party to now have a situation where its own views, its own proposals are now shifted aside, where it's told that you may not do it, I think would be going against the grain of what happens generally in society, because in that case, it would be no different. Of course, its voice would have a little bit more weight, but nonetheless, it also needs to have its voice heard. And I did say yesterday that the safety with all this is that in the end, the governing party is not the appointing party. It isn't. It may well have a bearing, but I was going to say, I know of no judicial officers who have a relationship with the governing party. And in fact, I would say judicial officers should not have a relationship with the governing party. Even how they vote, I don't want to know how they vote. But in the end, the governing party must play a role in further transforming our judiciary, and bringing in more women, bringing in more black people. By black people, I mean the full gambit of black, colored, Indian, and African. So the influence that it has, it is tempered by the appointment of the Judicial Services Commission. Now, yesterday, in the tea break, we even reflected that some of the, even the suggestions that the governing party has had have actually at times been pushed aside. And the JSC has gone ahead to appoint people who the governing party did not, who the governing party would possibly have wanted. It's gone ahead to appoint other people. So that's why I'm saying, Acting Chief Justice, that I'd like to implore you to look at it in a positive light rather than in a negative light. I don't believe that it does the harm that many people would think it does. And it happens all over the world. I mean, governing parties do make proposals, but as to whether finally those people are appointed, it is the appointing authority. And the good thing, as I think, I don't know whether it was, yes, it was Mr. Pretorius who said, our constitution sets up a much higher bar, much better. And I once heard the Chief Justice in the US saying that the South African constitution is, did they say the best, but one of the best? That's what they seem to have said. So the bar for us is higher. So the influence even of the governing party would be almost impossible to reach that bar.
Yeah, no, I think that one thing that needs to be made clear is that the process for the appointment of judges,
yes,
enables anybody and everybody who wishes to comment on any candidate to send comments to the JSC.
That's true.
To say, I think this candidate is suitable, this one I don't think is suitable, this one has got challenges or whatever. That's how transparent our process is.
Yes.
And in that context, there is no provision that says the ruling party should not send comments.
Yes.
Anybody and everybody and any organization may do so. It may well be that where those comments are sent, we go back to the issue of transparency, are sent transparently to the JSC.
Yes.
Then they get subjected to scrutiny in a public forum at the interviews, Whereas if they are not sent transparently, then there may be a problem. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Pretorius.
Yes, I'm just referring back for clarity to the provisions of Section 174 of the Constitution, which enjoins you, Mr. President, to appoint the judges of the Constitutional Court, and then to appoint all other members of the judiciary on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission.
Yes.
So you do have that power. But there is a distinction, is there not, between the governing party making policy statements to guide organs of state as the ruling party or the governing party. Distinction between that situation and the Judicial Service Commission receiving recommendations of particular persons, named persons, from the deployment committee comprising of very senior government officials, particularly in the context of the government expressly saying the governing party saying we control the levers of power and we have a system of democratic centralism. So there is a degree of authority that comes from, as the Chair has pointed out, that comes from the deployment committee to naming judges, not implementing or advising on policies of transformation, but naming particular individuals. Is that not a problem?
I revert back to what I said, that the safeguard in all this is that the governing party is not the appointing party or entity. And I want to repeat, there have been times where the governing party would have wanted a particular candidate, and the candidate in the end was not appointed, and a different one was. And to me, that just shows the robustness of this whole process. Because, yes, it in a way, it shows a preference, but the preference in the end is not the appointed person or official. And there are many other entities that would show their own preferences. It's possible that, say, a COSATU, which is a fairly powerful organization, could state its preference, but in the end, it is just a preference. It's not the appointer of those people. So I guess maybe we differ on that, but I differ advisedly in saying there is a safeguard. And I think the drafters of the Constitution have given us that wonderful safeguard, that in the end, the appointment of judges will never be the terrain or the responsibility by a governing party, but it will be by another institution.
Of course, it is also true, Mr. President, we all know that within the structure of the JSC, there would be quite a number of members of the JSC who come from the ruling party and therefore can be said to know what the ruling party stands for and what it would like to achieve in terms of transformation. I just mentioned that because, one, there would be a number of MPs who come from Parliament who are members of the ruling party, the Minister of Justice, who is part of the Judicial Service Commission, would probably all the time be a member of the ANC. So, but I'm just mentioning that there are those other people as well who would be expected to seek to look at what needs to be done to achieve a judiciary that is transformed, yes, yeah, both in terms of race and gender.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
But, Chair, yesterday you made a proposition which I responded to quite warmly when you said, what we do should be underpinned by transparency. And I'd like to once again say yes. To me, that is a rather wonderful and positive proposition, which obviously needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
Because we are not going to be able to divest, if one can use that term, any political party, be it the governing party or the opposition or any other, from expressing its preference. I don't think that's going to happen, but if we say, having done so, be transparent, so that it never gets seen as being underhand or happening in dark corners. And by the way, on the Judicial Services Committee or Commission, there sits other parties as well. And those parties will invariably also discuss amongst them in their own structures who they believe would be best placed. And so they will also, and this is how politics works, they will come with their own mandates and thoughts and put them forward. And in the end, it's really that contestation. And so I don't think we should say the governing party should not have structures that will deal with preferences that it can put forward.
Thank you. Mr. Pretorius?
Mr. President, as foreshadowed earlier today, if I may ask you to take your presidential hat off and put your hat of president of the party on, then I don't have to be so polite. What the chair said the first time you testified in your capacity as President and Deputy President of the African National Congress was the following, if I can just recite it once more and then ask you to please address his concerns. He said, well, talking about the fact that the ANC acknowledges that there were certain shortcomings, there were certain things that it might not have done properly and so on. I think that is quite important, that acknowledgement. But I would like you, maybe before you finish today or even tomorrow, I would like you to identify the actual areas where you say as a party we have done our homework. We think this is where we did not do what we were supposed to do properly. This is where we did something we should not have done. So we identify exactly the areas where as a party you say here we did not do things the way we should have and we acknowledge. In other words, he was asking to move from the general to the specific. And the reason he was doing so principally is to enable him to, quote, look at what should be put in place for the future so that there is no repeat, unquote. So may I ask you to address, please, Mr. President, those issues?
Yes. In my opening statement, when I addressed you, Chair, as President of the ANC, I did say that the ANC owns up to a number of things that did go wrong, that we did not attend to as we should have. And we have made missteps along the way, and being the governing party, we should have been much more prudent, we should have been much more aware of the consequences of some of the things that we did not do well. And maybe the nature of our transition from the past possibly informs this, because in the context of extreme inequality, where access to political office seemed to present one with few opportunities for sort of material advancement, and the pursuit of political office could lead to political patronage, one of the issues that we made some huge missteps on. Now, with regard to the ANC itself, we have owned up to this malady, which I would term a decline in organizational integrity. We have owned up to it. And in the contestation for political office, processes have been manipulated and, to advance the interests of certain individuals and people. And within our own ranks, there emerge another malady, which is factionalism. Then we had divisions, and they manifested themselves through factionalism. And through that, our ability to then tackle a major national project, which is corruption, was thwarted and debilitated through the factionalism that resided in our own organization, that also resided, that impacted its leadership. And in the end, it then led, the factionalism led to a number of people having vested interest in maintaining certain wrong practices. And the other fault line was patronage. There emerged a system of patronage within our own ranks, and our ability to act against corruption through organizational processes was made difficult in our own ranks. And the other problem, of course, had to deal with just how the organization could fund itself, the party funding. And we have not in the past had an official policy on party funding, who we can take money from, where we can refuse money, and that too led to enormous problems within the organization. And the other problem has been, just the weakening of institutions, and our own problems, and the factionalism that existed in our own ranks led to the weakening of institutions and even government institutions. And that could be said to be borne out with what we saw with some of the institutions, SSA and so forth, because they too became factionalized. So the weaknesses in the party then got translated in the state. But the question that possibly that you asked, what corrective measures are we taking to deal with this so that we can give a sense that we are moving away from all these very wrong practices? Now, obviously, in our own situation, we have embarked on a process of renewal, of renewing ourselves and getting the organization to adhere to the values that are embedded in our constitution, and making sure that we rid our organization of corruption and corrupt people and leaders who may be implicated in corruption. Now, that is part of the renewal process, and dealing with this process quite effectively. And now this is in fulfillment of our conference resolutions that have directed us to take steps against corruption, and significant progress is being made, but it also enables and empowers us as an organization to lead the process and institutions that we've been charged with overseeing by the people of our country, which is in government, that having started from the organization to act against corruption, to adhere to values of our movement, we then begin to translate that into what we do in the state. Now, some of the actions that we've been going on, embarking on in the state, how we've been acting against those people who've been, yes, either implicated and been charged with corruption, and how we are also taking corrective measures to reposition state institutions. The NPA is a case in point. And this is what has happened in recent times, as emboldened by conference resolutions. We have taken these corrective measures. The NPA was riddled with a lot of controversy, a lot of malfeasance, and we've straightened that out. And the work is by no means complete, but we're doing that. The Revenue Collection Service, SARS, is one case in point, and now the SSA and the South African Police and many institutions in government are now being, in a way, cleansed. And this we do as we are armed with what our base has directed us to do, the base being the governing party, the African National Congress. Because what we do in the ANC is what finally enables us to do what we are now doing in government. We have embarked on a path, Chairperson, where we are taking serious steps to cleanse our state and also our party. And this is a process. It's not a one-day event. It's by no means going to be completed in a short space of time. There's much work that needs to be done. Within our own ranks, we've strengthened, and we had this structure before, but we've strengthened our own Integrity Commission, and even the terms of reference of that commission have been amended to enable the Integrity Commission to call on ANC members and leaders to appear before it and to explain themselves if they've been said to be involved in malfeasance, either in the party as well as in the state. And through this, we're dealing with members who have crossed the line. As we said, we drew a line in the sand, and if you cross that line, there is a reckoning that you now need to countenance, because it has been a necessary step on our part to deal with these acts of corruption. And in doing so, we are repositioning the ANC, we're renewing the ANC, but we are also cleansing those institutions that by dint of being the governing party in government, we are responsible for. So that process is an overarching process, and we are determined to move ahead with it. Yes, sometimes we may make missteps, we may have reversals, but we are determined to continue moving forward. For instance, we are the ones, the governing party, dealing with matters of political party funding. It was the governing party that took a resolution that we should have transparency in party funding. And now we have an act of parliament, and it's been done, if you could say, at great sacrifice, because now the governing party has put strictures on itself with regard to party funding, but it was a necessary step to take, and it has now happened, and the party is strapped for cash, but it was necessary that this cleansing process should happen as we move on. And we are also in the process of instituting within the party itself processes such as lifestyle audits, so that in the party we should, and the discussion is ongoing and how it will be done, we should have people who will subject themselves to lifestyle audits, so that we can be clear and in a transparent manner that the people will rid themselves of any form of corruption. So this, Chairperson, these are the steps. Now, will they translate into ridding our institutions in government of corruption? I believe so. Because in a way, it's just as well that we've started it in the party. If we had done a top-down, just in the government only, and it remained in the party, it possibly would not have worked. So we doing the cleansing process, the renewal process in the party, and it will translate, as it is already translating itself in government. Will it be robust enough to last? I'd like to believe so, because as a governing party, we are duty-bound to engage the partnership in doing all this with the people of our country. Because they are the ones who are going to be almost the guardians to say, you've taken these steps to renew yourself, and that's why we will support you. And if you don't, then we will not support you. We've suffered quite a lot of loss of support because of corruption. And for us, it is an existential challenge. And for us to continue existing, we need to renew ourselves, cleanse ourselves, and by definition, in the end, the institutions we've been placed in charge of in government, we therefore also have to correct. So it's a dual objective, and the process has started, and it is going to gain momentum going forward.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do you think that the party did enough to deal with the situation relating to the influence of the Guptas after Mr. Mbalula had raised the alarm at the NEC meeting in 2011, and of course after the landing of the Gupta aircraft at Waterkloof, and with all the media articles that were coming up with in between, from 2010 onwards, about statements about the Guptas and so on. Does the party think that in relation to acting on those, it acted correctly? Or lack of action?
Chairperson, there was some action, but it was not enough.
Okay.
It was not enough. I mean, in relation, for instance, to the Gupta family's influence, I think we were blindsided by the fact that this family were friends to the ultimate leader of our party. And that blindsided us. But there were occasions, for instance, when Balula mentioned it in the NEC, yes, there was no immediate action, but he was brave enough to raise it. And that level of alertness was just not there because we were blindsided. The fact that these were friends of the president. And when the plane landed at Air Force Waterkloof base, the then Secretary General spoke out. He spoke out against this and almost immediately. And when I had the occasion, when the Gupta brothers came to the ANC headquarters to discuss this and other matters with us, I was one who specifically raised this and said, this should never have happened, and it put our president, who is your friend, in great difficulties. So, answering your question, was it enough? No, it was not enough. And it is for that reason that we've admitted, and it happened, as I said in my evidence when I spoke here as president of the ANC, that there was contestation in the party itself with regard to how you deal with all these matters, factionalism, the divisions in the party, and how you respond to acts of corruption. There was contestation. And we've led the process of change and renewal in the party. And the party, the governing party is a living organism. And it has had its own challenges. It's not the first and it's not the last governing party that has had to go through these challenges. Many parties around the world, from time immemorial, do have these types of challenges now. Of course, in our case, as it happens in other countries as well, it has a direct impact on the state, on the government, and on the nation. And in our case, we are putting ourselves before the nation and saying, we are renewing ourselves. We've admitted our wrong steps. As the then Secretary General of our organization, Gwede Mantashe, then said in his diagnostic report to conference that these are the problems that we are facing, and we're facing loss of support. We need to change. And contestation around that then intensified. But I firmly believe that that line that we drew in the sand, it remains firm, and the African National Congress is on a path of renewal and will continue to demonstrate that it will put the people of South Africa first and serve the people of South Africa, precisely what it was formed for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. In your affidavit, Mr. President, you analyze the various elements of the project of state capture. Rather than using simply a label broadly to describe the events of the past 10 years at least, you break it up into the various elements of state capture, what we've referred to in the legal team as the big picture, which involves not only isolated acts of corruption, or even many, many acts of corruption, but rather an organized project of substantial proportions, which involves not only acts of corruption, it involves repurposing of state-owned entities, repurposing of government departments, appointments, dismissals aimed to promote the project, the weakening of law enforcement agencies. We'll deal with that detail in due course. But for the chair, the distinction between a collective grouping of acts of corruption on the one hand and the project of state capture on the other will be very significant in his findings, and the legal team will address the chair in due course in that respect. But in answer to your response to the chair's question, there is perhaps another perspective that I think, for the sake of completeness, deserves your comment. And that is, during the period under review, there was a political process taking place. You describe it in paragraph 76 of your statement, or your affidavit. You say, it needs to be remembered that governance is not merely a technical function. It is an inherently political function which is influenced by the dynamics and the exercise of political power. My ability and the ability of others to resist and ultimately to bring about changes that would end state capture relied to a large measure on the political balance of forces within the executive, within the governing party, and within society more broadly. Now, the implications of that statement, if I may say, Mr. President, are profound, because they talk about a balance of forces, a contestation, as you put it, between those forces. These are not just opportunistic, isolated acts of corruption. There's a political project at play. And that circumstance compelled you, in your own statement, to take what you call the final option, option 5, where you say, the final option, which was what I chose, was to remain in my position as Deputy President, to work with others in the executive, to resist abuses and bring about change where we could, and to sustain the work of social and economic transformation. It was by no means an act of acquiescence. I believe this gave me the opportunity to resist some of the excesses that took place, which I speak to in the statement. This work, in my view, limited the extent to which state capture may have unfolded. So what you are describing is your resistance on isolated occasions to a force with which you are in contest, and which force, in fact, holds the balance of power. That's why you had to resist. So far from this being a series of corrupt acts opportunistically seized upon by individuals, what one was dealing with here was a situation where those opposing forces in contestation with the work of yourself and many others were dominant. They controlled the fate of the party, and in that sense they controlled the fate of the country. So this was, if one regards in the context of your own evidence, what was happening over the period of state capture, was a concerted exercise of power by the ruling party over dissenting forces. Is that a fair comment?
Well, it is fair. I think one should also see the option that one chose to stay in and, yes, resist. And I did say that if one had stayed in and been the gallant which was expected, on every turn, one could have been fired. So you had to choose your battles. you had to choose which ones would lead to tilting the balance. And fundamentally, it was also not so much the resistance, but it was also staying in so that through, if you like, the democratic process, we could effect the change, working together with others, effect the change that was necessary, and also begin to lead the renewal process. And fortunately, the highest decision-making body of the organization took a very clear and firm decision on dealing with corruption and also on renewal and getting the ANC to be repositioned, and also on forging unity within the movement. So armed with that, we're then able, yes, there has been contestation, as often happens in many organizations, but also to tilt the balance of forces so that the renewal process becomes the order of the day, where we no longer have to be butting our heads against those who resist renewal. It should be we are all aligned against malfeasance, corruption, and will act against those who engage in things like that, and including, simple things like, for instance, in the party, things like, quite often in political organizations, people will engage in acts of assaulting others, and you have to act against those. And sometimes they're glossed over, but you've got to act against those because they depart from the values of your organization. Abuse of women, that needs to be acted on. Acts of, say, patriarchy in the organization. So those are the things that we try to rid out of the governing party and tilt the balance so that more and more within the party realize that this is the best way in which the ANC can lead. This is the way in which the ANC can rightfully say that we have earned the right to be the leader of government. Yeah.
Of course, when you talk about being fired, Mr. President, although you or any member of the executive could have been fired from that position, nobody could fire you from the position of deputy president of the party in the absence of any misconduct.
Yes.
Yeah, you would remain in that position.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And it is a powerful position. Second in command in the ruling party. You hesitate, Mr. President.
Well, you are part of a collective, yes.
Yeah.
You're part of a collective.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, one implication of that, and it arises elsewhere in your statement as well, Mr. President, is that when you say you would have been fired, the implication is clear. There's only one person who could have fired you in that time. That was President Zuma.
Indeed.
You have been cautious in naming names, but that is clear. He was part of the state capture project.
Well, yes, I mean, I could have been fired.
Well, who would have fired you?
Who would have fired me? The president often acts also, I mean, I guess he would have fired me.
Yes.
It's a given. Or he could have fired me, I should say. I guess it never got close to that, but he could have. Like now I can fire others. So, yeah, that was the case.
Well, the statement or the implications are clear. If you say you were compelled, given the balance of forces, to choose option 5 and to be strategic about your intervention against these symptoms of state capture, which you were. If you say, as you've just said, had I chosen another option, I would have been fired. There's only one person who would have fired you.
Indeed.
That's the former president.
Yes.
In your evidence thus far, Mr. President, you've...
Let me just say, it's not so much that one was afraid of being fired. It was much more about seeking, as I said, to stay in, to bring about the change. It was not so much that one wanted to hold on to this position at all costs. No, I mean, even being in that position, a person like me was a great sacrifice, because one's life would have been a lot easier and much more pleasant. But it was to stay in, to bring about the change that we are leading and proceeding forward with now. And many people may interpret it in a variety of ways, but it has been a collective process of moving on with this change. And it's a change that will take time, because there's much more to be done as we move forward.
I didn't mean to infer at all, Mr. President, that you were motivated by self-interest.
Yes. No, I didn't think you were saying that.
No. Power, yes, but self-interest, no. I mean power within the party.
Of course.
And I think that's clear when you talk about the contestation of forces. But the point I was making, and I think we've been through this now sufficiently, is that for you to achieve what you wished to achieve, you had to operate strategically against the balance of powers against you.
Precisely.
And those were not isolated individuals performing isolated acts of corruption. They were concerted and united in their project.
Precisely.
In your evidence thus far, Mr. President, you have used the term, and dare we say correctly, state capture as a phenomenon that we must all accept occurred.
Yes.
But it's one thing to propound the label. The chair has the difficult task of isolating the elements of state capture and providing an analysis, historic and otherwise, in relation to each element of state capture, and then the most difficult task, his third task that he's assigned to himself repeatedly, of making recommendations which would assist in ensuring that these years don't repeat themselves. In your affidavit, you detail the elements of state capture. And I think it perhaps constructive to isolate the various elements of state capture that you put in your paper or in your affidavit, so that we're not just left after your evidence with just 2 words, that there is some meat on the bones, as it were. Because right in the beginning in 2018, when the opening address was made by the legal team before the chair, we posited the essential task of the chair, and that was to determine whether and the extent to which the period under review was characterized by a series of acts of corruption on the one hand, or by an organized project of state capture on the other. And that has been the focus of the chair for the last 3 years. But you isolate certain elements of the state capture project as follows. You say, firstly, the allocation and distribution of state resources determined by a network of persons outside and inside government, acting in collusion and acting contrary to constitutional and legal norms and rules. In other words, state capture is a project of the reallocation and distribution of state resources that should go to the constitutional goals set in our Constitution, but rather are redirected for private personal gain, both within and without government. When you talk of state capture, do you acknowledge that that has been, to a large part, the evidence before the Commission? Does that exist?
Yes, my own understanding, as well as what I believe has ensued in this commission, testifies to the existence of state capture. Because state capture in the end is a systemic process, and it's organized. And as we've seen it, the way it has happened or manifested itself, it's proceeded in a very organized way through the creation of a network of a number of people. And in this case, it was so well organized that those people had protection. So they could proceed with all they needed to do in the form of diverting allocated, say, funds, largely dealt with that, but also began to touch on some policy processes where policies were touched on, and even the legal processes were even changed. And it then led to transactions. Led to transactions that had to be entered into, and some of them, were repetitive type of transactions. And all of this happened for private gain, to advance the interests of few people, and it was all a process of collusion. Those people were part of the network, colluded with each other in the way they were appointed to these institutions. It was known that if this one is well placed here, they will have this type of influence. They will then be able to channel certain transactions in that way, and then there will be rent seeking in the process, and kickbacks would happen a lot easily. And it became they became emboldened, largely because of the protection that they had. The protection gave them cover, and they could proceed with all the acts that they went on with. So it really centered around filling certain positions with certain people and getting them to act together, collude towards a stated objective, which is siphon as much money as you possibly can out of the system, so that a few people can then gain. That's how I've understood the evidence that's been put here. But in the process, weaken as many institutions as you possibly can, and place people who are pliable, who will be able to do our bidding at all times. And that's why they were bold enough to say, yes, if you don't do this, you will be removed. And indeed, it ended up with people being removed and people being appointed and all that. So that is, how I think it manifested itself.
This allocation and redistribution of state resources, as you say in your statement, to the extent that it's part of the state capture project, is not directed to the public good as determined by laws and policies and by our constitution, but for private financial and other gain or benefits. In other words, there's a diversion away from the public good into the private purses.
Indeed, it did that. It diverted allocated resources from the benefit of the people to the benefit of the few. But one of the other derivatives of this is that it then increased the cost of nearly everything for the state. In some instances, many more people than were necessary were employed to do basically the bidding of those who had protection, and two, the goods and services that were then procured came in much more expensively. In some cases, possibly maybe 30% more than what it would have cost. In some cases, even 100%. But the worst part, I think, is that it had a poisonous effect on the state itself. Because no doubt, as people in other structures saw what was being done in other institutions, they just immediately thought that, well, this is par for the course. This is what can be done. And then it started descending further and further to various other parts of government institutions. And I think that is the worst part, because in certain instances people would have said, well, if this family can do that, we think we can do the same in other parts of government. We can even do better. And if they could have a monopoly of, say, government procurement processes, so can we. And I guess the other twin of that is that it disempowered the state. And as I said earlier, those who resisted being used in this way were either booted out or they left of their own volition because they couldn't stomach it all. So it had all these rather unpalatable results.
You raised an important element of the big picture, Mr. President, is that hand in hand with the execution of the state capture project is the observation that this is facilitated, and this is from your paper, from your affidavit, by a deliberate effort to exploit or weaken key institutions of the state.
Yeah.
For example, law enforcement agencies or even Parliament in its oversight capacity. And if I may quote back to you for your comment from paragraph, well, I don't have the paragraph number, but you would just bear with me a moment. You say in paragraph 169 of your affidavit, law enforcement agencies were vital to the success of state capture. There's a misprint there, so I'm not sure that that sentence should read as it is here. Their weakened state crippled them in their obligation to root out and punish those.
Mr. Turos, what bundle are you reading from? I think the President wants to.
Para 169, bundle 3.
Paragraph, page?
Page 82, bundle 3.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And it's paragraph 169.
Para 169.
Okay.
You have that?
I do.
If I may quote back to you your words, Mr. President. In relation to law enforcement agencies, you say, their weakened state crippled them in their obligation to root out and punish those guilty of corruption and state capture. Evidence that has previously been provided to this Commission makes this plain. The weakening of law enforcement agencies allowed corruption to go unpunished, perpetrators to be protected, and the public purse to be looted without consequence. It also led to experienced personnel leaving the ranks of these agencies, thus denuding them of the experience needed to investigate and successfully prosecute the sometimes complex schemes of those involved in state capture. Those are your words. Do you have any comment?
Well, it is so, Chairperson, that one of the targeted institutions that state capture really captured was a law enforcement agency. And the damage that has been done there has led to the weakening of law enforcement and ultimately the rule of law, where people today just act with impunity. I mean, and get away with a whole number of misdeeds because law enforcement agencies, as I said, were weakened, and those who were upright and good either left or they were booted out, and that weakened those institutions, and maybe less experienced people then came in, and some were compromised and some maybe not compromised, but the weakening then happened, and it all cascades downward. So the process of rebuilding all that, and we've got some really good people in there. We've got to rebuild, repurpose all that. And it is going to take time. I'm afraid sometimes as South Africans we expect a magic wand, that we will just wave a magic wand and boom, everything will be, as good as we want it to be. It is going to take time because state capture embedded itself in the sinews, in the muscle fiber of the state, and even changed the culture of how things are done, and to root all that out is going to, I'm afraid, is going to be a process. But we must stay committed to the task. And sometimes as South Africans, we are filled with doubt and rejection and complete opposition even to those who are trying to effect those changes, and outright dismissal and criticism. But the work has to be done. And unless we stay focused on doing the work, all is lost.
And I guess it makes sense and a lot of logic from their point of view that if you have a scheme that involves the commission of crime grants aid, that you should say we should make sure that when it comes to the police and the prosecuting authority, we should have our people there, because otherwise we'll be arrested and we'll go to jail. So from their point of view, you can understand why they would want to make sure that they weaken these institutions and they've got their people so that they would escape arrests and prosecution.
Yes, it is so. If I may posit another view, is that those who captured the state did, I wanted to say sprinkle, but sprinkling is not the word. They actually did populate a number of structures in government with their acolytes, their own people, who in some instances continue to doing their bidding. But then there's also been resistance. The resistance is there, it is fierce, and sometimes they call it fight back. They're fighting back against this change that needs to take place. And it is resistance against things being done correctly. And all this, and just to put it very simply, Acting Chief Justice, is to make sure that in our country we do things correctly. We do things according to the law, we do things according to the rules, and we also, as either leaders, officials, and people of our country, we act correctly in line with the contract that we have entered into, all of us collectively, which is our constitution and the laws we have. And this is what we should be all about. So the real project is to say, let us go back to the basics of doing things correctly. Whether you dub it corruption-free or whatever, it's just acting correctly in state and of course in the private sector as well. Let us be known as people of a nation that will act correctly and abide by the best of the rules that sort of underpin our civilization. Let's have that. So for me, that is the real project against malfeasance and corruption. And that is what will define us as a nation. All we want is to say, let us be defined by our own goodness, our own ability to do things correctly and abide by the laws and by the rules. So that those who are against this national contract we have should be dealt with, because they are spoiling everything for everyone else. And we should not agree that there should be those who will not play the game by the rules. And which is what happens naturally when we play games, like in football or whatever. If you violate the rules, you are booted out.
There are consequences.
Yes, there are consequences. There should be accountability. And it should be whoever it is. If you have violated that rule of soccer or rugby, there should be a consequence. And you should know upfront that here I have violated what we all agreed will be the rules of the game. And this is our project, and we must succeed.
Mr. President.
One element that you've touched upon, Mr. President, is not only the redirection, the reallocation of state resources at the cost of principally the poor people in South Africa, but the incalculable damage done to state institutions, requiring even further expenditure in the form of bailouts and the like. That I think is evident from the evidence.
Indeed.
You would agree. letter that you distributed to ANC members in August 2020 puts it this way: on a hugely different scale but with the same effect is the capture of state institutions by public interests facilitated by politicians and officials at the highest level. To put it differently, and to return to the essential point of these questions, Mr. President, is we're not dealing here in the period under review with isolated and disorganized acts of corruption. What we're dealing with is an organized project with all the features that you've mentioned, exercised in concert by those at the highest level of party and government. Is that correct?
Well, we are at 1 o'clock, Mr. Pretorius.
Well, you said that, Chair.
So I'll give you time.
Thank you.
Let's take the lunch agenda, Mr. President. It's 1 o'clock. We will resume at 2 o'clock. We adjourn.
Thank you.